a Reddit user made a thread in the Black Ops subreddit asking, why would there be 30-ish Wi-Fi networks seemingly emanating from under a concrete pad? The user went on to state that he had recently lived on a semi-urban farm property for a few months in Hawaii. He had noticed a few unusual things that he didn't decide to reveal. However, one thing that stood out the most was the fact that there were about 25 to 30 low-strength Wi-Fi networks somewhere in the neighborhood. In hindsight, it may seem normal to have a number of networks that are available, but what made the situation weird was that it was all exactly the same strength peaking at the same point location, and it seemed to be originating from underneath a concrete pad, which was made to simply cover gravel and dirt. The user then had the idea to utilize a Wi-Fi analyzer just to be sure that it wasn't some sort of coincidence where maybe numerous neighborhood networks somehow happen to have similar signal strength based on the distances they were from their sources. He also stated that he walked in circles while operating the Wi-Fi analyzer, and as he walked further from the point location on the concrete pad, the weaker the signal became. If that wasn't weird enough, another peculiar fact was that these network SSIDs would change every 5 minutes or so. In an effort to further uncover the mystery, he used a thermal imaging device to detect any hotspots on the ground. He then decided to drill directly on top of a spot that was notably hotter compared to other areas on the concrete pad, along with a number of other holes as a form of control. This was then followed by filling them with water. To his surprise, only the hole that was directly on top of the hotspot drained the water, and the others overflowed. Later on that same day, he was asked by other Redditors if there were any indications of a power source nearby. He answered by reporting that there were power lines, however they were disconnected from the city's main grid, and that there was a very wealthy neighbor who owns a steel frame building where the power cables go. He also states that the whole mountain area was being used by the military during World War II. This being the case, there are no reported military bases in the mentioned position, according to the militarybases.com website, though the user had mentioned that he had no doubt there are underground facilities there. While in the same comment thread, he asked 2 other Redditors for their opinion on the heat signatures. One of them replied by asking for photos of the surrounding area. The user then provided photos that sparked even more suspicion. These included a multi-breaker setup where the lower conduit runs under asphalt and toward the peak signal point location, with a corresponding hotspot, the hole that fills up with water, and a bucket found on the property, which he said reminded him of the hydroxide body disposal scene from the TV show Breaking Bad. The user was also asked if there was any way to measure the thickness of the concrete pad, because if the heat was coming from below, you would expect it to dissipate, not stay as focused as it seemed. In response, the user posted a photo showing that the concrete pad was about 2 times the thickness of the surrounding area. He also stated that it was extremely hard and seemed to have river rocks mixed in, whereas the surrounding area didn't and was easy to drill through with a hammer drill and masonry bit. As the user tried his best to drill into the pad, he managed to get to approximately 2 feet away from the hotspot location. According to him, the heat was unbearable there. He compared it to the inside of a composting bin, but there were no signs of microbial activity. He also noted that the soil was red volcanic dirt, which shouldn't have any biological activity anyway. Unfortunately, this is where the comment chain ends. However, there were other developments to this mysterious story. The user was then met with another question. He was asked if he could connect to any of the access points or gain control of the devices so he could identify a manufacturer. He was also asked whether the power meter was moving significantly, which would indicate it was powering multiple devices, and if there were any heat vents nearby. He replied that it was possible, however he couldn't crack the passwords. He didn't mention anything about the power meter, but he did send a picture of the general area where he suspected the heat vents could be hiding. In the same thread, it was also noted that the buildings seen in the picture had been partially built by questionable contractors. It was also mentioned that large liquid tanks had been removed from the ground there, meaning there had to be a lot of underground space available. At the same time, a nearby municipal storm drain was recently removed, and a newer, significantly bigger one was built directly opposite the property line, which he believed could serve as an entrance to an underground area of some sort. Additionally, there were 2 important factors the user shared. Firstly, he said that on multiple occasions he saw a truck making late-night trips to move a lot of busted-up, new-looking concrete from the trash bins of the neighbors. Secondly, and arguably the most important detail, he connected his old boss's account to an eBay seller going by the name of Cheesy Bay, which had extremely suspicious reviews and feedback. In a twist of events, the feedback and reviews were then set to private, which implied that the owner found out about his discovery. When asked about this, the user stated that he was in a, quote, pretty good spot, and that they wouldn't get him easily. So this is where the thread ends, but the mystery continues on. The mentioned eBay account was known to sell strange items such as faulty hard drives and other faulty electronics. Other than people looking to restore broken devices, who would actually think to buy faulty hard drives? This story takes an even crazier dive because that eBay account is where everything got linked to Pizzagate, a conspiracy theory that went viral during the 2016 United States presidential election cycle. The theory claimed that the New York City Police Department had discovered a pedophilia ring linked to members of the Democratic Party while searching through Anthony Weiner's emails. In the end, there is no real ending to this mystery. It was later reported that the original user allegedly had mental issues. This is supported by the fact that the user's old boss had actually commented and provided details about him, including the fact that he ripped off his ceiling fan because he believed he was being watched. He also claimed that there were no real connections as to why the user would suddenly intrude and link his boss's account to the eBay seller. Of course, the boss could be lying, because nearly everything discussed in the story had some form of evidence attached to it. Nevertheless, this mystery will remain unsolved. On Tuesday, December 16th, 2025, a Redditor posted in the home maintenance subreddit something that was eye-catching enough for moderators to delete it within the hour. The post was recovered by a viewer and sent to me on December 23rd. The post states, "I have cut myself pretty badly in my rented apartment. Fortunately, everything is alright, but I don't really want to notify the owners of damage on the walls. What would I need to make this disappear?" You don't have to look at the picture for long to realize this is a very oddly shaped and placed blood splatter. The original poster was very vague about how exactly he cut himself. It would have had to have been a pretty graphic accidental slice of a knife to lead to a blood splatter like that on the wall. There is a noticeable chip in the wall right in the center of the thickest part of the blood splatter, which would imply the blood wasn't sprayed on the wall, but rather the blood on the wall was the result of something hitting the wall. What makes this post more unsettling and suspicious is that the user is known to post in the alcoholism subreddit, stating he gets drunk on average 5 days a week. But according to one of his other posts that was made just a month before this one, his girlfriend had cheated on him and left him due to his drinking, and she left him right before the ring he ordered had arrived. The viewer who sent this to me reported this in the RBI subreddit, which stands for Reddit Bureau of Investigation, which led to the poster blocking him, even though he never directly contacted him. So, I'm sure I don't have to explain where I'm going with this, but whether this could have been a deleted post that was in reality a man secretly trying to cover up something horrible that happened in his apartment involving his cheating ex-girlfriend, or simply just a very unfortunate coincidence, for now remains a mystery. It's not uncommon to hear cases about squatters living illegally in other people's houses without their knowledge. This is the story of a Reddit user named Random Girl to You, and it happened in 2016. She was coexisting with an individual who she actually knew, but would never have expected to be the intruder. Understandably, she didn't share a lot of information, but enough was said to show just how creepy her situation was. The whole ordeal was posted in the form of updates over time, meaning she was actively finding evidence in the form of random objects around her house, particularly in the attic. Now, up to this point, it may seem like any other story about a typical squatter living illegally in someone else's home. I've even covered stories about squatters in people's attics before, but what transpired while he was there is more terrifying than any of those other stories I've covered. The user started her story by mentioning that she lived in a fairly large house. In her bedroom, there was a door that led outside to a small porch. She went about her day like she normally would, sweeping the ebony-stained wood floors, something she did often because the material showed even the smallest speck of dirt or dust. She continued her usual routine when suddenly she stumbled upon a tooth sitting right in front of the door on the bedroom floor. Judging by her almost OCD nature, it seemed like the tooth had just recently appeared. She said it had not been there at any moment earlier in the day. She was so shocked that she stood frozen, trying to recall if she had accidentally hit her head and forgotten about it, or if she had been experiencing a toothache and didn't notice one falling out. Still confused, she stood there running her tongue along her teeth to confirm it wasn't hers. After discussing the situation with other users online, the topic of a squatter living in her home surfaced. As reluctant as anyone would be, she finally accepted the possibility, especially because she had already noticed a number of odd things happening in her house, such as missing items, random objects being out of place, and other strange instances that might normally seem trivial but still raised an eyebrow. Living alone has its ups and downs, but in a situation like this, it's never a good idea to investigate a potentially hostile individual in your own living space. But being that as it may, the user replied that it would take too long to wait on anyone, so she went to investigate alone. What she found was only the beginning of a nightmare. It started with finding a smudge in the opening of the attic. Still worried about her safety, she decided to take it slow. She sat and waited to see if there would be any signs of life. She lost track of time sitting in silence, listening for any sound or movement, but all she got was the pure silence that had been accompanying her the entire time. The following days were filled with updates about her findings, and the more she looked, the creepier it got. Because she wasn't very tall, she could only peek slightly past the attic opening. Luck was on her side. A quick scan of the attic layout showed that there were objects laid about, but no visible sign of a person. Still disturbed by the thought that she might not be living alone, she decided to get a taller ladder and a better flashlight. That kind of bravery motivated other users to keep urging her to get to the bottom of the mystery. And it makes sense. She worked in enforcement for Game and Fish Commission, and she was trained. But even she admitted she was a smallish woman living in the middle of nowhere. In the next update, the user confirmed that someone had been living in her attic, matching both her suspicions and the suspicion of other users, but the intruder was not present at the time. Some of the items she found were 8 beer koozies, some of her own personal belongings, a pile of change, and a $20 bill. At first glance, those items might seem harmless, but it gets worse from there. As time went on, law enforcement eventually got involved to help locate the squatter and remove him from the property. Usual procedures were carried out, such as objects being dusted, prints being taken, and items being located. She began to calm down as she realized she wasn't alone in this anymore. In due time, she was told that someone had been visiting her attic for a very, very long time. After hearing that, she made it a point to start locking her doors and even installed new locks just to take an extra step for safety. Unlike most squatter stories, this one was especially unique because the intruder only visited the attic when the user was home. The case was later considered a stalker case based on the behavior and items found. Some might ask why weren't her doors locked in the first place? Well, her response to this exact thing was she didn't lock her doors unless she was sleeping. She lived in a small community of about 400 people, so it was a very slow, quiet lifestyle there. She also said she wasn't worried about robbers because if someone really wanted to break in, a locked door wouldn't stop them. But what she couldn't understand was the tooth. It didn't make sense because it wasn't even on the path that led to the attic, and if it wasn't for one top comment, she would never have thought to check the attic in the first place. The user knew the sheriff well, which is expected in such a small community, and that made things even worse because she started to feel like it could be someone who knew her personally. A quick update later revealed that she was receiving unsolicited, explicit photos while all of this was happening. It was never confirmed who sent them. The user eventually went through the safe where evidence was kept, and what she found was pretty disgusting and horrifying. There were 2 giant pickle jars that the intruder had been using to collect his semen. Among other things, there were thousands of tissues, maroon socks, towelettes, and more items of the same nature scattered around. On top of that, there were also the user's clothes that had been missing for over a year, including underwear. That alone puts into perspective how long the creep had been doing this, moving in and out undetected and carrying out his acts while she was completely oblivious. There were also strange items like a plastic butterfly, a bobblehead wooden turtle, more beer koozies, and black and pink straps with Velcro on the ends. Very weird, questionable things to possess in someone's attic. Sometime later, the user received a call that was supposed to put her mind at ease, that should have answered all questions, that the perpetrator was caught and the nightmare was over. But instead, the identity of the intruder would haunt her for the rest of her life. It turned out to be the 70-year-old neighbor, married to the same woman for countless years, who happened to be a church deacon, father of 4, and grandfather of 6. This one's perhaps one of the more uncomfortable ones to keep your doors locked at all times of the day. There's no additional information regarding an arrest or updates on the old man. This one is perhaps one of the more uncomfortable reminders to simply lock your doors, maybe the easiest and most obvious preventative measure you can take. This final story comes from a Reddit post in the famous subreddit called Let's Not Meet, and the original poster's account has since been deleted for good reason. From what we can gather, the story suggests the poster was an adolescent male from North Wales, UK, a place known for its beauty and natural landscapes. However, being in the countryside, there isn't much to do, and as teenagers, curiosity is a dangerous fuel. Teens will always want to explore, but when the daily routine mostly involves herding animals, harvesting crops, picking fruit, and similar activities, it's only a matter of time before a teenager snaps. So, out of boredom, the user and a few friends often found themselves wandering the countryside and coastline. Despite the area being sparsely populated, there was a road with 2 separate carriageways running right along the coast from Wales to England. There were also train tracks that ran alongside it for most of the way, occasionally passing overhead via a small cement bridge. One night a few years ago, the user and 3 friends decided to explore one of the bridges where the train passed overhead. When they reached it, they noticed a manhole cover nearby. Upon closer inspection, they believed it led to some kind of access room. Intrigued, they tried to pry it open, but without tools, they couldn't. So they returned the following night prepared. Unbolting the cover wasn't easy. They had to work quietly because the train tracks were right next to them. Not close enough to endanger them, but close enough that the train conductors could spot them and raise alarms, which would likely mean the police. Surprisingly, it didn't take long. They lifted the heavy steel disc and wasted no time climbing down the ladder, not knowing where it led or what could be waiting below. Once they reached the bottom, they moved deeper into the structure. At this point, they were completely confined inside a narrow passage leading into the main area. They were perplexed by what they found. They had always assumed it was just a bridge, and if they hadn't found the manhole, they never would have guessed there was an interior space at all. The group endured a torturous journey, squeezing and crouching through whatever space they could find. They scraped their stomachs against the walls as claustrophobia slowly crept up on them. The distance from end to end was far longer than expected, but at the halfway point, they were able to look through narrow gaps in the ground and see the road below them, which strangely gave them a sense of comfort. At that moment, it was still just an adventure. It was uncomfortable and cramped, but it was manageable. But that was about to change. Just before passing the halfway mark, one of his friends claimed he could see something in the distance at the far end. Hesitant but curious, they all agreed to check it out. That turned out to be a terrible decision. The user was the first to reach the end of the walkway. He stated that the dread he felt in the moment was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. There was a single foldable chair facing a wall, and on that wall was a partially torn page from a newspaper or magazine, showing a fully nude woman in an erotic pose. But he even said he couldn't refer to it as a normal erotic picture, because the woman's eyes had been removed from the page as if someone took a knife to them. Below the picture on the wall, there was a bloody condom on the floor, and when they saw this, the boys left as fast as humanly possible, desperate not to run into whoever was responsible for what they had just stumbled into, which almost seemed like a crime scene to them. When they reached the ladder, every one of them silently prayed the manhole hadn't been resealed. They wouldn't know until they reached the top, but luckily it was still open. The reason the user mentioned the population earlier was because what they had witnessed was completely out of the norm. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and where anything weird going on would be hard to fly under the radar for long. In the end, being a naive teenage boy, the user never told a single soul what they found, but he admitted later that it would have been wiser to report it, because it was clearly not the behavior of a healthy-minded person. The story ends there, but the user did post updates about returning to the location multiple times, hoping to have something to update with. Eventually, he stopped because the investigation wasn't going anywhere, and it was better to stay alive than to risk his own life.